increases blood flow to a particular area. Heparin is an anticoagulant. In other words, heparin tries to block the clotting process. If you slow blood down in an area, it tries to clot. Heparin keeps that from happening. Right? That's kind of a good thing. Right? When we start to look at things like inflammation, we're going to increase blood flow to an area and it's going to get congested. We don't want it to clot. We still want it to stay nice and thin so that the white blood cells can climb out of our bloodstream. If everything clotted up, then they may not be able to move. So the text said something funny about prevents immobilization of phagocytes. Okay, it allows them to move. It prevents immobilization. It's a funny way, at least in my mind, it's a funny way to describe it. But what it does is it keeps them free to move. Our blood doesn't clot off in little capillaries. So two very important ones. Increased blood flow, and essentially the heparin is thinning the blood a little bit. It's one way to look at it, because that's how we use it medically. It helps to thin the blood a little bit, keep it flowing. We'll use that in a minute. Number 4, lymphocytes. Lymphocytes were our second most common of the white blood cells. So neutrophils were first, lymphocytes are second. And you've already heard, we have lymphocytes all over the place. In our spleen, in our tonsils, in our lymph nodes, in our thymus. Again, just what you measured in the blood is just that, what's in the blood. But many of these white blood cells are out in the body. Lymphocytes are really good ones. Lots of different forms of lymphocytes. I think they're actually still categorized as lymphocytes. Nowadays, they refer to some of the lymphocytes as natural killer cells, NK. You'll also hear killer T cells used. Right? And I've mentioned T and B cells a little bit up to this point. So there's lots of different lymphocytes. So don't get hung up on just this NK. The T cells, the B cells, the memory cells, lots of interesting ones that we'll talk about. This is probably the most diverse group of the white blood cells. I don't even think I'll say probably. It is the most diverse group. And we'll see they have lots of interesting functions. But you see, what these will often do is they'll attack host cells. They'll attack your own body cells if they know the body cell is infected. Right? If they see that it's infected. For the greater good, they kill it. They will try to kill those cells. So that's what we mean by it lyses, or it'll attempt to lyse or blow up host cells that are infected with viruses or cancers. These are pretty important cells. We hope these are working very well. And we will gladly sacrifice a few cells that are infected to prevent further infection. So we'll come back to more on lymphocytes in a bit. Lastly, monocytes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Are the T cells and B cells bad cells?
Are they what?
Are they bad cells?
Bad cells? Oh no, they're great cells. We love them. We love them. I thought I mentioned this the other day. Maybe I didn't make it clear. The T cells, remember, they were the lymphocytes that spent a little time in the thymus to get educated, to learn what is self and what is not. And what happens when we get an infection, our normal body cell doesn't look normal anymore. So these cells kill it. Okay? The B cells were another form of lymphocyte, and when they're told, hey, there's a foreign invader in, if it's a foreign invader they recognize, instead of going and killing it, they produce antibodies. The B cells will end up doing that. So there's your kind of specific response right there. T cells and B cells. For cellular response versus antibody response. But we'll see it again. We'll see it in a couple more, probably on Monday. So the last one, the fifth of our white blood cells, our defense cells, the monocytes. So of the bottom 3, they were the most popular in our bloodstream. Right? 3 to 8%, roughly speaking. Circulating precursors to macrophages. That's exactly what I said before. These circulate in the bloodstream, but then they can be activated and crawl out of the bloodstream, and now we call it a macrophage. And physically changes shape. It gets a lot bigger, it looks a whole lot rougher. Okay? In the bloodstream, it's nice and round, so it can flow nicely. But once it gets out, it does change its activity, so we change its name. So monocytes become macrophages. A really interesting feature of macrophages is they function as APCs, antigen-presenting cells. Okay, if you really start thinking about the immune system as this constant battle that your body's undergoing, these are the real amazing warriors. When they encounter a foreign invader, they will do everything they can to kill it. And one of the last things they'll do is, I think of it like Braveheart. Remember the movie Braveheart? I love Braveheart. Okay, but remember when they killed the one prince and they cut off his head and they sent it back to the king, okay, to alert them, hey king, we're serious. Right? That's what these cells do. Is when they see a foreign invader, they take a piece of that foreign invader and they literally put it on their surface. Where their own ID badge is, they hang the head of the foreign invader that they've tried to destroy. And now they can go around to other cells and they can present that to them. They can show them, hey, here's who's invading us. So that's what we mean by antigen presenting cell. Okay? It's a very important role because that helps us with specific immunity. These guys, macrophages, are really part of both systems, the general or the non-specific immunity and specific. So they'll gobble up something that they just know isn't normal. Then they'll put a piece of it on their surface and show it to other white blood cells to teach them, to alert them. Get ready, something's coming. Come. Okay. All right, so pretty cool. Very much warrior cells. We see them all over the place. So these are the major players, okay, in our immune system. That's what we said before when we were doing the blood. Red blood cells are carrying oxygen and CO2. The white blood cells are there for defense. So now you've got a little idea of the specific nature of their defense. Okay? There are other things used. I don't care about them. But because you may have heard of them, or I know you will in your micro class, interferon, complement, lectins, all these funky things. These are all essentially just little chemicals that can be produced that can help us fight foreign invaders. There are a lot of people now looking at these things for cancer treatments. They're saying, okay, if your cells go rogue and they're now a cancerous type cell, is there something that the body manufactures that we can use, that we can throw in there? So interferon is a big one right now. I keep hearing an awful lot about interferon therapy for cancers. But it's essentially producing some funky chemicals. In this particular case, this diagram shows you an example of one of these chemicals. It can be produced by the cells. It can sort of be injected into the foreign invader. And all it does is it stays in the cell membrane and it forms a nice little hole. Punches a hole in it. It kills the cell by doing that. We refer to those as perforins. But that's what it's doing. That's how it's going to hurt this cell. So it's not necessarily a poison. It's just going in and physically disrupting the membrane and hoping that that will kill the foreign invader. So people are trying to use stuff like this on cancer cells, but limited success so far. All right? So I'm not going to worry about those details. I'm going to focus on the antibodies and the cellular stuff. Your textbook on 8, so that's really hitting that table back from the blood lab. Because now I'm coming back to your textbook for this chapter now. And up on page 826, they give us a little description of what's happening with those natural killer lymphocytes. And it's a lot of the same thing I just talked about. Is here you go. Here's a natural killer cell, and it's producing perforins that will go and attach to the enemy cell, form a nice hole. Then it can inject enzymes if it wants, or it can let the substance in the cell leak out. Either way, it can end up killing that cell. This is one of the methods or mechanisms that these killer cells will use. Once that cell's dead and done, well then a macrophage comes in and cleans up. We don't like to just leave dead stuff laying around. So this can be a real warrior cell, but it can also be a significant cleaner cell. It's tidying everything up. And once it's done this, absorb the cell, well, then it can take a part of that cell, stick it on its own membrane, and present that to other cells to say what else is going on in the body. Does that make sense? A lot going on there, a lot of neat stuff going on. Okay, so I don't know why your textbook spent time on just that one. I think because it's the sexiest one. Look at the natural killer cells and macrophages. But that was actually very much a part of the specific immune response. So on 822, if we go back, we can look at the details on the non-specifics for a second. Okay, so I mentioned them briefly on my list. This is just getting it out there. All right, just getting it out there. So external barriers, obviously, stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, we see that your skin, because we have these multiple layers of cells, and those outer layers of cells are dead, there's not a whole lot there for some foreign invader to take advantage of. Normally we like nice, moist areas to grow something. So that's going to help us retard the growth of bacteria or viruses, just having that thick layer with dead cells on the outside. We also have a little bit of lactic acid that's produced in our sweat. So this is generically referred to as acid mantle. That's kind of a weird term because mantle is something we use in like marine biology. We talk about creatures that have a little mantle that they put on the outside of their shell. Okay, well that's kind of what we're doing, putting a little something on the outside of our shell, but it's sweat. It's not really tissue, it's just fluid. And a lot of times it will have a certain amount of acid in it, and that acid will retard the growth of bacteria. Same thing in our tears. We'll add some acidic components, or we'll actually add some lysozyme. We'll add a little enzyme to our tears that helps prevent infection. If you really think about it, our eyes are at great risk. You know, when we're not asleep, they're pretty much open all the time. And they're nice and fluid, so it would be a nice area for bacteria to get in and try to grow. So we have to do something with our tears. Our tears are not just pure water. Yes, we do have some lysozyme in there that will try to break down anything that does stick in the fluid on our eye. And then underneath our epithelium, especially in fatty tissues, we usually have a little bit of gel secreted around the cells that again has some acid in it. Hyaluronic acid, I don't really care about the name, I just want you to know it's kind of acidic. And acid is usually pretty good at defending against bacteria. So that's just a little more detail on that external barrier, okay? At least the first one, looking at skin. If we look at fever for a second, I said before, the whole point with fever is to make our body inhospitable. We don't want to be hospitable to these foreign invaders. We want to be inhospitable. So having a little acid around is great. In addition to that, we can jack up the temperature. All right? So hopefully that will inhibit pathogen reproduction. Specifically, it won't let the bacteria multiply, hopefully. That's the idea, if you have the heat high enough. Macrophages, again, are very important in this role because they'll stimulate chemicals called pyrogens that will act on the hypothalamus and reset your temperature. Our hypothalamus controls our body temperature typically. But once pyrogens are initiated or secreted, then it seems to increase the body temperature. I don't know if there's another chemical that decreases body temperature. I've never heard of that. You don't hear too often of somebody having too low of a body temperature. So I think this is about it. A couple of notes here. Way back last semester when we were looking at temperature in terms of homeostasis, we mentioned briefly some of this issue about once you get up, higher than 102, we start doing more damage than good. When we get up to 105, our cells really, especially in the nervous system, aren't functioning very well at all. So you can get patients who are really out of their mind. Right? The delirium business. We get up above 110, now we're really risking death. So if somebody comes to the emergency room and they've got 110, that's when you start getting the ice baths or the alcohol baths out. You've just got to cool them down. You can't rely on medicine at that point. It's got to be cooled immediately. So 105 is okay. You give them medicine typically. They're going to respond to that. Some places are a little quicker. I know at one of the hospitals I worked at when I was in college, they had cold baths already this time of year when it was flu season and all. But I don't see that as much nowadays. So there's lots of nice little detail on the separate stages of a fever and how that fever goes. So on 827, you see normal body fluctuations. 37, remember from our digestion lab, we put the water bath at 37 degrees Celsius. That's about body temperature. That's about 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And throughout the normal day, we're going a little up, a little down all the time. Right? Negative feedback. We're always adjusting our temperature a little bit. We're around that area, that 37 or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. When we get infected with something, macrophages chew it up, they release some pyrogens, that tells our hypothalamus to start increasing. So now you see, you start raising the temperature. That's what they refer to as onset. This stadium business is kind of interesting, is that we tend, at least with most disease processes, we tend to reach a plateau. Okay? It doesn't just keep going up and up and up and up forever. And that plateau is usually around this 39, so usually around about 100.